In this segment we'll cover movement. We covered the basic concepts of movement when we looked at scale. If you know about the space on the map, the amount of movement allowance given to each unit. Then we examined in command and control which units could move in a given turn. So we're going to carry on by looking at how and when units move in the game. I'll try to use the term movement to refer to the motion of individual units and those mechanics. I'll try to use the term maneuver to describe how formations move on the field. We'll start with voluntary movement. That's combat units, or leaders, in good order, moving voluntarily in their assigned segment. Now we looked at the space and scale as well as the movement potential assignments. You know roughly that units move across the map into terrain. Let's look at the costs of those terrain features. This is a typical movement chart listing the terrain and then the cost for the different branches to either enter or cross, like in the case of the stream here, that terrain feature. So as units move across the map, when they enter a particular terrain, they subtract that from their remaining movement potential, and they keep doing that until they go as far as they want to or they run out of movement potential. So this infantry battalion could move 1 into the clear terrain, 2, 3 into the cultivated, as we saw on the chart, 4, 5 into the village, 6 into the clear, and then that orchard costs 2 as well. So since he's at 6, he could not move into that orchard. But this brings us to some concepts that we need to now cover. This is not a rule book, so I'm not going to organize things quite the same way. I'm just going to introduce things as they fit into the topic we're covering. And that's the question of, well, what was I really doing here? What is this guy, and why was I moving straight ahead? And that brings us to formations and orientation. These are military units. They're going to adopt military formations appropriate for the time. And that's going to be key to not only how they fight, but how they move as well. So we'll try to look at infantry and cavalry at the same time here. Now the first formation is column. Column is, well, I'm not going to do a drill manual, but it's more of a closely packed formation, suitable for maneuvering. The French used it for fighting, but generally we think of it as good for movement. So a column formation is indicated by orienting the counter towards a hex side. So what does it mean to orient the counter? Well, essentially, this, top to bottom, this is the front of the unit. These are linear tactics, so all these men are facing a particular way. And when we're in column, we're basically saying that the men are looking this way. Now, every formation is going to have a different orientation to it. What's front, what's flank, and what's rear. And in column, for infantry, the front are these 3 hexes, flank are these 2 hexes, and rear is the one right behind it. A column formation is always going to be in one single hex. Cavalry is a little different in that they have far more front hex sides. It actually has all front except for this very rear hex side. Now, specifically that's for light cavalry. Heavy cavalry is a little different. It really acts a little more like infantry. So this heavy cavalry unit has 3 front hex orientations, 2 flank, and 1 rear, very much like infantry. This is a useful chart from the Premier rule set that I'll refer to that will show us both formation and the orientation associated with that formation. So this is infantry, 3 front, 2 flank, 1 rear. And there are the cavalry formations. Light with virtually all front orientations, one rear, and the heavy cavalry looking a lot like the infantry. Since column formation is very friendly to movement, the full movement potential assigned to the unit is available for movement. So that means in column, this infantry can expend 7 of his movement points. For the light cavalry or the heavy cavalry, they can use the full allowance given to them. So with 3 front hex sides of the infantry here, they could move straight ahead, or they could move sort of sideways that way, or this way. They can move straight into any of those front hex sides. So we can see how that gives this light cavalry quite a big advantage. Since they have front hex sides all around, they can move in virtually any direction very quickly, and with their higher movement allowance, get someplace really fast. Another formation is line. I'm not going to do a drill manual, but line is more of a spread out formation to bring more muskets to bear for combat. We indicate line by tilting the unit to face a hex vertex. And the effect of that, and both cavalry and infantry can form into line, the effect of that is twofold. One, it changes our orientation. Line has 2 front, 2 flank, and 2 rear hexes. And that holds the same for cavalry. But it also diminishes our movement, because line is really more of a fighting formation, not so much of a maneuver formation. We generally decrement the movement allowance by 2 when we're in line formation. So when a unit begins to move, they start with 2 fewer increments of movement. So this battalion would start with 5. They could move 1 here, 2, 3, and then 4, 5. Now, actually, I can only form line formation in clear terrain. So if he moved here, as soon as he entered that cultivated, maybe this game is different, I'm not sure, but certainly by the time he reaches this village, he has to move out of line formation. He's going to occupy a different formation, and we'll cover that in a few minutes here. Same holds true for cavalry. In line formation, this guy would start with a 12, and he can only move into these front hex sides. He doesn't have that all around facing anymore. Back to the chart, we see in a unit in single hex, 2 front, 2 flank, 2 rear. If infantry has more than 4 increments, they can split into 2 hexes, basically spread out their line across 200 meters. In that case, it's just adding the front but retaining the flank, and then the rear corresponding to those other 2 front hex sides. There's more on that in fire combat when we get there. And here are some similar charts for the cavalry. Again, it looks very much like the infantry. Certain units, both infantry and cavalry, can form into skirmish formation. Skirmish is kind of a spread out, loose formation meant to cover a lot of ground and provide screen. It's represented by turning the counter on its face, showing the backside. With enough increments, more than 3, it can occupy 2 hexes. Here we have a 2 increment unit. If we deploy him into skirmish, he would occupy 1 hex. Cavalry, no matter the size, if they are able to form into skirmish, which usually only certain light cavalry can do, it will occupy 2 hexes. Many effects of skirmish, but we're only going to talk about what it means for movement. So for infantry in a 1 hex skirmish formation, we end up looking with a lot of front hex sides. Basically all around this arc here is front, and then 2 rear hex sides. If we're in 2 hex, it's basically the same. An arc all the way around, and then we have a flank. This is actually a flank hex here, and then a rear. And cavalry is very much the same. Front, all around here, flank, and then rear. And the chart makes it a little clearer. You have the front all the way around and two flank, or the front all the way around, two flank, and then the rear there. And cavalry looks the same. Now I can't see it anymore since they're face down, but the full movement potential allocated to those units is still available when they're in skirmish mode. Because they have the extra front hex sides, it means they can move laterally pretty easily, as well as forward. And the same terrain costs apply to this mode as well. So if you moved this here and then into the cultivated, he would now have expended 3 movement points. As far as keeping their skirmish formation, that'll depend on the particular title, but often skirmishers are able to stay in this formation even when they enter, non-clear terrain like cultivated or towns. Infantry can adopt a particular formation intended to defend against cavalry. It's called square in English. I won't try the French pronunciation. And it's indicated by putting a marker on top of the unit. This is a nice looking marker with the French flag and the square formation on it, so we sort of know what nationality is underneath it. Now, a unit can adopt this formation either voluntarily or in response to a cavalry attack, but we'll cover that later. When in this formation, they have all around facing. But they have very limited mobility. They can adopt this formation, as I said, in clear terrain. They have to have at least 3 increments of strength to maintain the formation. And when they are in this formation, they can basically either move 1 hex while in that formation, or get out of that formation and get into a different one. Now there are many different aspects to the square formation, but we'll cover those when we get to them. Keep saying that. But for movement purposes and orientation, that's the main effect of it. A bit ago, I had this unit moving in line formation. They entered here and then they entered the town. I said, well, they can't necessarily maintain that formation in the town. And when you can't maintain a formation of one of the ones I've just described, you enter what's called general order. It's just sort of a catch-all for rough, rugged terrain where you can't form neat, orderly lines of men the way they've been trained to on the clear parade grounds. General order is a little like column, but because you're in more of a every man for himself formation, you have more front hex sides, so all the way around this arc, then you have 1 rear hex side. When you are in general order, you still maintain all of the movement allowance for the unit, so they can expend the full 7 movement points. They can go this direction, that direction. All the front hex side directions are available to them. And here's how it looks on the chart. Front all the way around, 1 rear. Since I forgot square, there's a square with all around facing. Column is good for maneuver, but even better for maneuver is road march or road order. Road order is when you have your men spread out on a road purely for the purposes of moving, not expecting any combat. Now, only 4 increments of strength can occupy any hex. So if you have more than 4, as we did with that 7, we would put down 2 markers to indicate the men are actually spread out on 2 hexes. Now, in general, this will give the unit better movement because they're moving orderly fashion along the road. The specific title will determine what that cost is for the road, but in our particular case, roads are going to cost us half a movement point. Now, this is actually a trail here, but I don't have a good road I can look at. So this guy could move along the road through, terrain features. Sometimes it will allow you to negate the cost of the village. So in theory, he could move up through this village much faster than if he were in column or general formation. Kind of giving short shrift to artillery here. But artillery generally is considered to be in road formation whenever it's on a road. I mean, if it's limbered up, then it's ready to move. So since I used the word limbered, I may as well get to artillery. Artillery is essentially one of two conditions. Limbered, ready to move, that's when we see the front of the counter, or unlimbered, ready to shoot and fight. Artillery has a special ability to move, however, when it is unlimbered. In general, they're permitted to prolong the guns one direction in their front orientation. And when the guns are unlimbered, they have 3 front, 2 flank, and 1 rear. I don't have that on a chart anywhere, so just take my word for it. And when they're limbered, they really move like an infantry column. Front, flank, and rear. And then they have full movement potential of 6 when they're limbered. There's a special movement called force march, which essentially allows you to increase the movement potential of a unit, and actually it's generally a larger organizational unit like a division or a brigade, by testing morale and risking a disorder if you don't pass. So if you pass, you're able to move at double your rate. That can get you across the field much faster, but also risks tiring out your men and ending up in disorder. Basically, infantry and artillery can be a part of force march. I took some liberties with my terminology during the discussion on morale. I refer to it as states of order, which I think fit for that discussion, but really it's thought of as an involuntary formation. So we have a unit here, and if he suffered a disorder, we know he'd be marked with the counter, and that's an involuntary formation disorder. Now, in his movement phase, he would be permitted to move half his movement allowance voluntarily. A disordered unit has all-around facing, so he can move in any direction. Of course, that's really just to help him get the heck out of the way, get away from them fighting. Now, if the unit is plus grand disorder, during the voluntary movement phase, he can't move at all. He has all-around facing, but he can only move in a special retreat phase at the end of a turn, and his goal is to get far away from the fighting. So he can move at least his movement potential, and in the premier rules he can move 10 points if he's infantry, or the movement allowance for the counter if it's artillery or cavalry. So infantry is sort of given this ability to run faster away. They pay terrain costs, and they move across the map just like any other movement, but it's only for the purpose of retreating and getting away. They have to continue that every turn until they're either recovered, or they get at least 15 hexes away from the enemy, and then they're required to enter some sort of cover terrain, like woods or towns or something like that. And then they stay there until they recover. We have all these units and we have all these formations and their effect on movement. How do we get from one formation to another? Well, when we voluntarily move, we get to choose a formation we want to switch into. Every change of formation costs movement points. So for instance, I have this unit in column. I could move him 1, 2, and then I could choose to change formation, say into line. So now he's in line. Now he still has, the cost for doing that is 1 movement point for infantry to change formation voluntarily. So he would have now expended 3 movement points. He still has his full complement remaining. The cost, the penalty for being in line is only assessed at the beginning of a phase. If you start out in line, you start out with 2 fewer movement points. So in theory, he could move in line right up to the edge of his movement potential. So infantry costs 1 movement point to change formation. Artillery, they can be limbered or unlimbered, so they cost 2 movement points. So I could move that artillery company here, and then on Limber, and he will have expended, 3 movement points. Cavalry costs 3 movement points to change formation. So this unit in column could move down here and change into line, and he would have expended 6 movement points. Let's look at a couple of subtle differences. So I have this unit right here in column. He can move free of charge, or just the cost of the terrain, and that orientation. What if he wants to change his facing, his orientation? He wants to point a little more this way. Well, we rotate him on the hex grid, and now he's facing this way. In the Premier Edition, it costs a movement point to change facing. Now, let's suppose I'm here. What I really want to do is to face over here. That means I would have to move 2 hexes. It's a little unclear exactly what the cost of that is. Is it 1 movement point per hex side, or just 1 movement point to pirouette in the hex any way you want to? But it does cost. In the 5th edition, facing changes are free. There were variations that said you could change for free as long as you were moving. I think right now the rule is you can change without expending movement points. There's another little interesting bit. In the Premier Edition, line is line. You're facing forward, you move forward. If you want to get some other direction, you change facing. The 5th edition has a special little, I call it a crab walk move, where you can expend 2 movement points to move laterally. Just kind of a nice little ability to maneuver, a feature of a line. There used to be, I shouldn't introduce these used to be's, but there was at one time an ability to about face a line. I've looked for it and I haven't found it, so it may not be there anymore. But that was really convenient because you could about face. Maybe have some skirmishers up here covering you, about face, and just get the heck out of there. Now we already talked about prolong with artillery, but the 5th edition permits artillery to change facing, essentially an about face sort of thing, in the face of an assault. We'll cover those kind of things later, but for movement purposes, if this guy is trying to close in combat that artillery, the 5th edition rather lets him pivot to meet the attack. That's pretty big. It goes from being a flank attack to a frontal attack. That can really change the outcome. We first looked at stacking as a function of scale, just the limits to the amount of men and material that could occupy one space. Now that we have formation and facing and movement, we're going to expand on that a little bit and show how those things relate. Every title will have a stacking chart like this that will list the branches of service here, the terrain, and then the formations and the limitations of the units that can occupy that space in those formations. Simple rules state that infantry can stack with infantry. Artillery can stack with artillery, again up to the stacking limits for the space. Limbered artillery can stack with just about anything. It's sort of a quasi horse and person formation. But unlimbered artillery can only stack with infantry. Now, facing and formation. Only like facing and formation can stack in a single hex. So if we have a unit in line and another one in column, we want them to stack together, we have to adopt the formation, same facing for the hex. In stacking, basically in terms of other systems in the game, the unit on top is sort of considered front in the hex, and those beneath it are sort of lined up behind it. So generally, if I had a unit in line here and one in column, and I'm removing this one, whichever unit was deemed to be on top, in front, the other units in the stack would adopt that facing and formation. Now, similarly, we have cavalry. Cavalry can in general stack with other cavalry. So I could put another cavalry unit there, up to the stacking limits for the hex, of course. But cavalry doesn't like to be around infantry or unlimbered artillery. Stacking with them is a no-no. But limbered artillery is okay, because that's sort of a quasi-horse formation anyway. And the same goes with horse artillery. If I had some, I'd show it. It's buried in my counter mix. I don't want to find it. Now there are certain nationality restrictions. Like this is a Russian cavalry regiment, and this is a Prussian. They would likely not be able to stack in the specific rules for the title. Now we know we have another formation called skirmish. This is that light open formation for infantry, also for cavalry. And basically, it's possible to move through these formations without any difficulty. But you generally cannot stack different formations in the same hex. So stacking line with skirmish would be a violation. But I can move infantry through that infantry skirmish line, but I can also move infantry through the cavalry skirmish. Maybe more interesting is that when we get to it, when we have cavalry, we're going to charge. We can charge through the skirmish line without any difficulty. Now, those concepts are common between the rule sets. Another very common idea is that if you have a stacking violation of some kind, the penalty is a morale test for that hex. And there are a variety of penalties associated with that. But if you fail the morale test, you would disorder and then displace. And if you pass the morale check and yet you're still in a violation, then you just displace and keep your good order. The particular modifiers change between the two rule sets, but in general, that is the same approach they take. Now let's look at some pretty significant differences here. In the Premier rules, if you want to stack units, just stack them. As long as this doesn't violate the quantity of increments permitted in the hex, that's perfectly fine. Any old way you want to stack units, you can stack them. Not so in the 5th edition. If I want to stack 2 units, I have to have a leader in that hex. Some command presence must be there to allow those 2 units to stack. Now there is probably 2 exceptions. One is that some units have a regimental presentation, and if I want to stack those units and then replace them on the board with their regiment, I can do that. And then that regiment functions as a single unit in the game for all purposes. The other 3 are removed from the game board, but at any time I can then break down this regiment into its constituent battalions. Another exception is the square formation. If I form that unit into square and I move another unit into that square, they are free to stack without a particular leader present. Now if I have that leader there stacking those units, there's some combat activity and he's killed, technically these units are in a stacking violation because there's no leader there to keep them in place. So in that case, we just have to displace one of the units from the stack, or as many units as are necessary to leave us with just one. So here's my beef with this rule. We know that a battalion is not the fundamental particle in the game universe. There are a bunch of companies that make up any battalion. That means there's an implied leader holding that battalion together, effectively allowing those companies to stack. An implied leader. We already saw the implied leader of the regiment. There's a colonel there that's allowing his 3 battalions to stack. An implied leader. So, you know where I'm going with this. Why can't I do this? 1st and 2nd battalion in 1 hex, and there's the 3rd battalion. Because the colonel didn't just disappear from existence, he's still there. Why can't I think he's right here keeping these 2 battalions together? Well, I know from a game perspective, playability perspective, why. Because that would be a nightmare to keep track of all these implied leaders. But it just makes me, sort of curious as to why the general has to be present and oversee the colonel and sort of usurp his position just so I can stack those 2 units. Especially because we've already seen that leaders like this are command, so his primary function is going to be keeping the command structure together, not stacking units. So the only way for me to effectively stack units is to move lower aids around and create little stacks. And maybe it keeps me from creating some sort of a super team of huge units to go blasting through the game board, but effectively I'm never going to do that anyway because I know it'll expose my flanks. So it means that I'm going to spread out my units just by definition, and on very rare occasions will I find myself stacking them. There's another important concept arising from formation facing that affects movement, and that's called zone of influence. And many games use this concept to, I think it's just to sort of break down that artificial wall of scale that we put up to keep things in order, because we know that these things aren't happening in little bits of time increment as we play. So we have this zone of influence around units to sort of establish the fact that they actually are able to affect things going on, and they're not just sitting there frozen while some other activity is occurring on the field. So every combat unit and artillery, when they're unlimbered, exhibit a zone of influence in their front-facing hexes. So we have column and line and all the different formations, and they have a zone of influence in those front-facing areas. Now for movement, what that means is often units have to stop moving when they enter that zone of influence. So infantry must stop movement when it enters any zone of influence. Same for artillery. Cavalry can keep moving through a zone of influence if they wish for infantry artillery, but that does come with penalties in terms of combat results and implications, so we'll cover that in the combat phase of our presentations. But that zone of influence essentially stops a unit from moving when it enters the front. Now again, square is a slightly different beast. It has sort of a zone of influence. It has a zone of influence for combat purposes, but not for movement. So I could move freely through this square's hex sides, but I'd be subjected to combat, which we'll cover later. And both rule sets basically agree on this concept. No real differences, except in the Premier rules, say if infantry is here and he's in the zone of influence of that opposing unit, if this guy wanted to, he could just move forward, exit that zone of influence. I should mention it costs no movement points to enter or exit zones of influence of infantry or artillery or cavalry, except when cavalry is in skirmish mode, but that's complicated and we'll cover that later. So Premier, I can just keep right on going. Not so in the 5th edition rules. Once I get into a zone of influence, infantry and artillery cannot leave unless they're stacked with a leader. If they are stacked with a leader, then they can move out of that zone of influence. So this is another one of those exception rules that brings leaders into a slightly different orbit than I think what the rules really want them to be, which is command. So this is an interesting conundrum. I want leaders to command, but occasionally I have to get them in the front lines and sort of disrupt my perfect command structure. I've got to get them there to stack. I've got to get them there to extricate units that might be in a difficult situation and locked in a zone of control. Yes, I said zone of control by mistake. It's zone of influence, but it's the same thing. Now, one other subtle difference between the rules regards advancing into an enemy zone of influence. Now, in the Premier rules, if I want to advance this unit, I simply march him in, and that's fine. Whatever happens later in the turn, whatever kind of combats are undertaken, they'll happen when they happen. But now with the 5th edition, if there's an intent to initiate a close combat, that has to be declared at this point when you start to move the unit. So we would move them adjacent, mark them with an assault marker, and now they're locked into a combat later in the turn when that occurs. So it's a small difference, but it really kind of establishes an intent to that movement. Well, that was a really long explanation of movement, so I think I'm going to take a break at this point and continue the discussion of maneuver in the next installment.